The Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has arrived in Tehran. He's been received there by his Iranian counterpart Hassan Rouhani. Now, all of this centered around the visit coming at a time when Tehran and Ankara are weighing in on how to respond exactly to the Kurdish independence referendum in Iraq. Live visuals on your screen from that strategic meeting between Rouhani and Erdogan. Now, Iran and Turkey are among some of the countries that have opposed the vote in the Iraqi Kurdish region. Turkey already has several thousand ground forces stationed in northern Syria, and President Erdogan has stated that he will not accept a Kurdish state along his borders. The visit, of course, hinging on Ankara trying to shore up consensus on how exactly to block efforts by the Kurdish regional government to split from Iraq. Live visuals on your screen from the Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan's visit to Iran, where he's meeting with Hassan Rouhani, the President of Iran. There are a number of issues up for conversation, some of them, of course, dealing with regional security. But top of agenda is probably going to be the contentious Kurdish referendum, the vote for which took place just a little over a week ago. Now, Turkey, Syria, Iran have all come forward to reject the referendum. Of course, Turkey has its interests in saying so. Remember, Mr. Erdogan has stated quite clearly that he is vehemently against and will not accept a Kurdish state along his borders. The Turkish Foreign Ministry, remember, had also said on Tuesday that it wants Iraq to take over the control of the border between Turkey and the semi-autonomous Kurdish region of northern Iraq, which is currently governed by the Kurdistan Regional Government, the KRG. Now, remember, the referendum resonates tremendously with Turkey, where the fear is that it would have an effect on Turkey's 15 million ethnic Kurdish population. If Iraq is to see a split, it will have a ripple effect in many ways on other countries in the region. Now, Mr. Erdogan, ahead of his visit to Iran, had told members of parliament in the Turkish capital that he wants to come together with an agreement with Iran on how exactly to respond and retaliate to the KRG referendum. Of course, among the other issues that might come up for conversation are regional security issues and the fight in Syria. The de-escalation zones in Syria are probably going to come up for conversation. In fact, they were probably going to be top of agenda before the Iraqi Kurdish referendum. Now, of course, things largely different. Let's go across to my colleague Daniele Pagani, WION's international correspondent, joining us live from the newsroom for more on that story. Is it safe to assume, Daniele, that the talks are going to hinge on the shoring up of, let's say, a response in many ways to the Kurdish referendum, considering Turkey and Iran are aligned on where they stand on the referendum?
Definitely, yes. It's definitely safe to assume it. Obviously, that is going to be on top of their agenda. We will now see what exactly they talked about and what kind of response, if at all there is a possible collective response on the Kurdish referendum. We have to consider that this is the second time that President Erdogan travels to Tehran in the last 3 years. And to give a little bit of background, Iran in this moment is the perhaps most powerful country in the Middle East when it comes to areas of influence. There are tens of thousands of militiamen fighting both in Iraq and in Syria. Iranian-backed militia fighting both in Iraq and in Syria, and on the winning side against Islamic State and against Al-Qaeda and other minor jihadist organizations. So this gave Tehran the possibility to influence the entire politics of the region through these militiamen. On the other hand, Turkey has been pretty much isolated in the recent events. For instance, Turkish troops have not been allowed by the Iraqi Prime Minister Haider al-Abadi to participate in the Mosul offensive. And also the Turkish troops did not have a very significant role on Syrian soil, despite now being part of the so-called de-escalation zones in Syria, which is a plan aiming at creating safe zones, ceasefire zones within Syria in order to try to solve once and for all the Syrian crisis. So Iran right now is perhaps the most powerful actor in the Middle East. Turkey is not. So this is a meeting that Turkey needs way more than Iran. And even when it comes to the Kurds, Iran has the smallest Kurdish population in the entire region, 5 to 6 million. No, well, actually Syria has the smallest, but Iran also has a very irrelevant Kurdish population within its borders. And historically, even if there are separatist movements, armed separatist movements active on the mountains between Iraq and Iran, the Iranian Kurds have lived pretty peacefully within the Iranian borders. So we can say that actually Iran doesn't really have an internal problem with the Kurds.
Sure.
Also, we can say that if Iran decides to lock the border that it shares with Iraqi Kurdistan, this is not too much of an issue when it comes to trade and economy. Remember that Iran shares almost its entire western border with Iraq. So even if they close a couple of border crossing on the northern part, they still have kilometers and kilometers of lands and many border crossings through which they can send Iranian goods to Iraq. This is not the case of Turkey.
Right.
The only part of border that Turkey and Iraq share is on the Iraqi Kurdistan border. So if Turkey seals that border, they need alternative ways, perhaps through Iran.
Absolutely. So clearly the outcomes from this meeting are going to be more significant for Ankara than Tehran. We'll have to wait and see if President Erdogan is able to bring some sort of consensus on how to respond to the Iraqi Kurdish referendum. We'll leave it at that. Daniele Pagani, thanks very much for joining us and giving us that perspective on the story.